Hey guys, so today I want to talk about some basketball stuff again. And 5 years ago, I made a video called the top 10 most underrated NBA, ABA players of all time, who at that time I made a chart, an Excel sheet that calculated all the different scores, according to the awards and stats of each player. And I ranked them, and then I gave my opinions on who I thought were the top 10 most underrated players at that time. And today I kind of want to expand upon that a little bit. So I revised my algorithm a little bit. So as you can see, my chart has actually been expanded a bit. This is my data sheet of the top 200 NBA players. I put all the different NBA players that I know are even not just Hall of Famers. I put guys that are not in the Hall of Fame, but were close to being Hall of Famers, right? Just like multiple All Stars, or even just like two All Stars. I put them all in this data sheet, and I expanded the categories a little bit. So previously used to be only these categories, plus their regular season stats and their playoff stats, which is just very, very basic. So again, we're going to keep that. We have All-Star, All-Star MVP, All-NBA second team, All-NBA first team, and they all worth different points. So All-Star's worth 1 point, All-Star MVP worth about 2 points, I think. It's not really that big of a deal to get it. All NBA second team worth 2 points. All NBA first team worth 4 points because it's more important, right? The second team. All defensive second team worth about the same number of points as all NBA second team. All defensive first team worth the same as all NBA first team. So I added the defense aspect into it as well. And the reason why I didn't have this before was because for older players, it's actually really hard to know whether or not they would have been an all defensive team. But I think I have a good idea of what players would have been chosen for the all defensive first or second team for older players before 1969, because that's when they added the all defensive selections, right? So I kind of just added it in for those players because I have a pretty good idea who was the defensive leader during that time. Then I have steals, assists, and rebounds leader. Again, no steals or blocks because it's really hard to track for older players, so I don't put in steals or blocks. But I added this defensive stats anyways, which is a lot more. I would say before my old algorithm didn't really account for defense at all. So now you're going to see my new chart, my new spreadsheet. It's going to have a lot of defensive players that weren't there before, which I think is very fair, right? Because defense often gets left out. Defensive player of the year, the way I calculate this, because we know defensive player of the year wasn't really available before 1983. It's I calculate based on the win shares, defensive win shares, right? So I look on basketballreference.com and I look at who has the highest defensive win shares for each year before 1983, and I give that person the defensive player of the year. It's not really accurate, but it's the best metric I can use. If anyone has a better metric to use for awarding imaginary defensive players of the years, then let me know. Then rookie of the year, I had this before. Rings, of course, I give 6 points to rings. And MVPs, I give the most to MVPs, 10 points. The reason is because MVPs is for a full 82 regular season game, and it's actually more important to me than Finals MVP because for 82 seasons we get to see who the best player is, right? Finals MVP is only for 7 game series, right? One 7 game series versus an 82 game season, right? So I think MVPs is more valuable than Finals MVPs, and that's borne out in the fact that every MVP so far has been elected to the Hall of Fame. And there are some Finals MVPs that haven't been elected to the Hall of Fame, like Cedric Maxwell and Andre Iguodala. I don't know if he's going to get in. So that's why. And the Finals MVPs, I still give some points to this. I give about 6 points to Finals MVPs, which is pretty important, right? Because if you're the best player in the finals, then that's pretty important in my calculations. So I give a total award points right here, and for Finals MVPs, they weren't available before 1969, so I kind of calculated them according to Bill Simmons' Book of Basketball. He gives imaginary Finals MVPs to players he thinks should have won it that year. Most of them went to Bill Russell for the 1960s, of course, but still, yeah, I went off of his book for that. This is to make it fair, right? Because obviously Bill Russell should have had Finals MVPs, and it wouldn't be fair for me not to give him Finals MVPs, given that he should have, in order to make it equal with other players of the current era, right? And then I have the regular season scoring average, rebounding average, assist average for both regular season and playoffs. So this is important because I had this before, and I know that people are going to say, well, this isn't fair because some players play more minutes than other players. You have to use per 36 minutes is going to be the normalized adjustment. But I'm not going to go by per 36 because honestly, I think a valuable trait to have in a player is to have stamina, right? So if a player played more minutes and got more points and stuff, that should be awarded to them, right? Because they played more minutes. And I don't think it's fair to normalize it to the per 36, because that means the extra minutes that that player did, say Wilt Chamberlain played 45 minutes a game in his entire career, is not fair to dock him for that, right? Like, to be able to play more minutes is actually an ability. That's a talent, right? You have more stamina, that's a talent. So you shouldn't dock players for being able to play more. So that's why I didn't average it, like I didn't normalize it to 36 minutes per game, which a lot of people do, which I think isn't fair, right? Because if you play more minutes, you shouldn't be docked for that. So yeah, that's why I have the regular season raw stats here. I don't have the per 36 adjustment. I don't think that's fair. I do have true shooting percentage, which I think is a better calculation than field goal percentage. Field goal percentage doesn't take into account like free throws and everything. So true shooting percentage is everything put together: your 2-point percentage, your three-point percentage, and your free throw percentage. That's all, everything put together is your true shooting percentage, right? So I have true shooting percentage here, and then I have per, which is a stat made by John Hollinger, and it's a really this is an advanced stat, an advanced metric that's more geared towards people who are offensive, but still, it's still a valuable stat to have. So I have per up here as well in the calculations. And then I have the true shooting percentage and per for both the regular season and playoffs, because both of them matter, right? Just like for career. So for everything here, regular season, for averages, sorry, for scoring average, rebounding average, assist average, for a true shooting percentage and per. Then for total points, total rebounds, total assists, this is something else I added in as well, and total win shares, I have this both for career and for playoffs all added together. And the reason I added the total points as well is because I do think that longevity matters. So if you just take a player in a vacuum and you look at their prime, then you're going to have a very different ranking than players who play their entire career, right? So like Vince Carter, for example, played a very long time. So he has a lot of career totals. And if you just look at, if you don't count the career totals, then he's going to be ranked very low, which I think isn't fair for a player who has longevity, right? So just like for stamina, I think it's important that a player has longevity. So I think that should be counted somewhat in their career. So that's why I added this new category for total career points, total rebounds, total assists, not just for average. If you just go by average, it's biased to players who didn't play a very long time, actually, right? So Bob Pettit, for example, he only played 11 seasons. He never really had a down season, so he's going to be uplifted through if you're just looking at the averages. And then like Vince Carter, for example, obviously he played a very long time, but his averages went down over time. But it's not fair to dock him because of his longevity, right? I think longevity does matter. And yeah, ultimately, how many years you can play in the NBA, that's going to be a factor, right? So that's why I factored in total career points, rebounds, and assists, and win shares as well. Win shares, I think, is important too. So that's why I had that in. So I add them all together. That's how I get the ranking. I get the total ranking is from the total awards points plus all the averages added together for regular season playoffs, plus the true shooting percentage and per added together, plus the total career points, rebounds, assists, and win shares all added together and averaged up. And that's how I get this list here. So this is a much more comprehensive list than the list I had 5 years ago, which only focused on averages and awards. This one has it has a true shooting percentage per advanced analytics added in, as well as the career totals added in. So I think this is a much more comprehensive list. Anyways, based off of this list, I can now get a better idea of who is more underrated or not. So you have the 200 players here. If you guys want to have the spreadsheet, by the way, I'm going to link it below in the description. So you guys, if you're interested to see all 200 players here and how I ranked them, then you have access to it. So I have everything up to Steve Francis here, who is my number 200 pick. And there are some guys that you might not see here, like Penny Hardaway. Some guys didn't make this cutoff. Richie Guerin is another one that kind of just missed this cutoff. Mark Price, they kind of just missed this cutoff. So this is just for the top 200 in my rankings. So if you're wondering, hey, where's Penny Hardaway? Well, they didn't make this list. Sorry. That means they're not in my top 200. But yeah, everyone else here, you can check it out on my top 200 list. All right, so now we're going to look at the top 20 most underrated NBA, ABA players according to my analysis. This is an expanded list from my previous one 5 years ago, so it's not just top 10, it's top 20 now. And yeah, so how I'm going to rank this is, you might be wondering how am I making the criteria of how underrated they are. Well, I go on different social media platforms like Facebook, Reddit, some basketball forums, YouTube, of course. I participate in a lot of these chats and a lot of these discussions. And I also look and watch a lot of these sports shows like ESPN or NBA on TNT or NBA The Jump or Fox Sports, right? Sports Illustrated, Bleacher Report, all these different magazines, right? I look at all these articles and stuff, and like Colin Cowherd and Nick Wright, like all these other sports talk shows as well, right? I do listen to a lot of them, and I'm gonna give my view on how underrated a player is based on what awards and achievements they've achieved and how often are they mentioned or brought up by different fans and analysts. And that's how I'm basically going by this, right? So the thing is, everyone these days, I think there's a recency bias, right? Everyone likes to talk about the players that are in the NBA right now, of course, because that's what's going on. And of course, they might throw in some older players' names, like they might throw in Magic or Kareem or Bird, Kobe, of course, Michael Jordan, obviously. They might throw in some names here and there. But I think overall, I'm going to look at the names that are not very mentioned a lot. Like they're not mentioned a lot compared to the achievements that they've achieved. So even some people might say, "Oh, Hakeem Olajuwon is underrated. He's not mentioned all that much." Well, he's underrated compared to how much he's mentioned, like compared to Shaq or compared to compared to other uh, great players. But overall, I think he's not underrated because he's still mentioned a lot, right? Or Moses Malone, even. Moses Malone is underrated too, but he's still mentioned sometimes. Like he's not mentioned as much as Hakeem is, even. He's not mentioned as much as Shaq, but he's still mentioned occasionally. I'm going to look at the names that are really, really not mentioned all that much compared to how much they achieved, right? So like even someone like David Robinson, I don't think is some people might think David Robinson, Moses Malone, they're very underrated, but to me, they're not all that underrated because they're still mentioned sometimes and they're still ranked pretty highly on those all-time lists. I'm gonna go by players who I think get left out of these conversations a lot and who are really not ranked very high by fans and analysts, even though they should be. So this is what I'm going to go by, okay? And that's my criteria for judging how underranked or how underrated a player is. All right, I'm going to start off with some honorable mentions because we're going to go for 20 players here, but obviously there's way more than 20 players who are underrated, right? I mean, you could say that most players in NBA history are underrated because pretty much out of all players in NBA history, we only talk about the most recent ones and the really superstars, right? So obviously, I would say most players in NBA history are underrated, but I'm going to talk about top 20 and then just throwing some honorable mentions here that I'm not going to talk about in depth, but just throwing out there. Okay, Horace Grant, I think is really underrated. He's in my top 100, and which might surprise some people. Horace Grant was a really key, pivotal part of a lot of championship teams, like especially the Bulls teams, the first three runs, and that Lakers team in 2001 as well. Some people forget that Horace Grant was on that team. Horace Grant was also part of that finals team for the Magic too, which beat Jordan, by the way. So Horace Grant, I think, is pretty underrated. He was a very good defensive player, very good rebounder. And if you look at his win shares, like he belongs in the top 100 players all time, and people just don't mention him. So Horace Grant, honorable mention there. Chauncey Billups, I think, is a really good player as well. He's also in my top 100 list, and he doesn't get mentioned as often as he should be in the greatest point guards discussion. He's a top 15 point guard of all time. He was a Finals MVP, obviously, in that 2004 Pistons team. Still not in the Hall of Fame yet, so very underrated player. Zelmo Beatty is pretty underrated, I think. Most people don't know about Zelmo Beatty, but he won Finals MVP and a championship in the ABA, and he played for a while in the NBA too. So he was one of those players that he averaged like 16 to 10 a game, I think. It's a pretty decent player in the NBA, and he was a Hall of Famer as well. He got inducted the last 10 years, I believe. But yeah, he's pretty underrated because, almost no one mentions Zelmo Beatty. People just forget about him. Even in 60s players, right? Even when we're talking about the 60s players conversations, I don't think a lot of people know about him. And he was a champion. He was a Finals MVP, and he's a Hall of Famer. So he should be mentioned more of the greatest centers list, right? All right, Billy Cunningham, I think, should be mentioned more as well. Another honorable mention to him. He's he was an ABA MVP. He played in the ABA for a few years, and he was like immediately MVP in that league. And just a crazy player, like averaged 20 and 10. You wouldn't think that a player like that could average 20 and 10 in his career, but he did. He had a crazy, like he has a crazy vertical for the type of player he was. That's why he's called the Kangaroo Kid. And yeah, just overall player not mentioned very often in the small forwards or power forwards conversation, which I think he should be. He's definitely a pretty good player, like stats wise and efficiency wise, I think. Sidney Moncrief, I think, is really underrated. He was just inducted in the Hall of Fame like a year ago, I think. So he's definitely underrated even by the Hall of Fame, and he was the leader of that Bucks team in the '80s, which is actually pretty good. One of the best defensive guards of all time, a two-time Defensive Player of the Year, and one of the best shooting guards of that era. So if you wanted to name like the best shooting guards of the '80s, obviously you have Michael Jordan, George Gervin, but Sidney Moncrief belongs up there in that discussion. He was definitely one of the best shooting guards of the '80s. Doesn't get mentioned very often, and even left out of the Hall of Fame for a very long time. Walt Bellamy, I think, is pretty underrated. Also in my top 100. These guys are all in my top 100, by the way. Averaged 20 and 13 in his career, and yeah, he gets left out of a lot of conversations because most people don't know that all these great centers like Zelmo Beatty and Walt Bellamy played in the '60s. They're actually competition for Wilt, right? Wilt actually had competition in the '60s, guys. So these guys are Hall of Famers, right? Walt Bellamy was he was a beast on the boards, and he should be mentioned more in those discussions, but obviously left out because Wilt dominated these guys so much. But still a Hall of Famer, right? Roger Brown. Roger Brown's very underrated. He played on the Pacers in the ABA his entire career, which might be why he's left out of a lot of these conversations, because he doesn't really have any NBA stats, and the NBA doesn't really count for ABA guys. So he gets left out a lot, but by all accounts, he was one of the best small forwards in NBA history, especially during that time. So when he was playing the ABA, he was playing against guys like Dr. J. He was playing against Rick Barry, right? And he won against those guys. I remember he was playing against Rick Barry in the ABA finals, and even though Rick Barry had better stats, Roger Brown still won the game. So the Pacers, they were a really good team, and Roger Brown was a pivotal part of that team. Also unfairly banned from the NBA for that scandal, the same one that banned Connie Hawkins. So anyway, shout out to Roger Brown. He should definitely be mentioned more, and it's because he played his whole career in the ABA, and he got inducted after he died, which is a travesty. But yeah, Roger Brown, shout out to him. Wes Unseld, also rest in peace, Wes Unseld. He just passed away a few days ago. One of the great underrated centers, I think. When you talk about great centers in the '70s tend to get overlooked in general. So other than Wes Unseld, I also want to mention Nate Thurmond and Dave Cowens as well, because in addition to the other '70s centers I'm going to mention in this video, Dave Cowens, Nate Thurmond, Wes Unseld, all these guys are pretty underrated because they played in the '70s. Bob Lanier is another one, right? All these guys in my top 100, very underrated because they played in the '70s, and people just look down on the '70s. They don't think that the '70s was very competitive. It wasn't a very popular time for the NBA. So guys like Unseld and Thurmond and Willis Reed. Talked about Willis Reed in a previous video. He's not going to be in this video, but I think he's going to be in the same vein as Unseld and Cowens and Thurmond. All these guys in the '70s, kind of underrated. Jerry Lucas, I think Jerry Lucas is pretty underrated as well. I think he was definitely one of the top power forwards, if not the power forward after Bob Pettit, I would say, of the 1960s. He was probably the second best power forward of the '60s after Bob Pettit. And he was an incredible rebounder. He averaged over 20 rebounds a game before, which only Russell and Wilt could do. And it wasn't that easy to do even back then with the higher pace, okay? So averaging 20 rebounds is quite a feat. And he averaged over 15 for his career, which is, top 5 in rebounding average all time. So he's definitely one of the best rebounders of all time, and a very smart shooter as well. He shot in the perimeter, I think much like Bob McAdoo, who I also think is underrated, but not enough to put him on this list. But yeah, I think Jerry Lucas he even predates Bob McAdoo as a perimeter shooting big man. So I think Jerry Lucas deserves more credit for that. He was a perimeter shooting big man, like probably one of the first ever, and a huge rebounding guy. Like he was insane on the boards. So yeah, shout out to Jerry Lucas. Hal Greer, I think, is also underrated. Hal Greer was probably after Oscar and Jerry West, probably the third best guard of the 1960s. And if you look at his resume, like he was All NBA second team quite a bit during the 1960s, which means he was the second best guard at his position for a huge chunk of that decade, right? So if you want to look at underrated people, not many people mention Hal Greer when they're talking about. I mean, Oscar West, obviously they get mentioned, but Hal Greer just gets completely forgotten, along with Sam Jones, I would say. But I would probably say Sam Jones, although he's a really good player as well. I probably put Hal Greer ahead of Sam Jones, so that's why I think Hal Greer is more underrated and deserves to be mentioned. All right, so those were my honorable mentions. Let's go forward with my top 20 most underrated NBA, ABA players. All right, so I'm going to go through each of these guys. I'm not going to spend too much time on them because, not like my previous video, right? Because this video I have 20 guys to go through, so I don't want to take up too much time. I want to keep this video in a reasonable length. So I'm just going to tell you guys what position they're ranked on my chart, on my spreadsheet, all time, according to my analytics, and then how high they're ranked according to my personal opinion on their positional rankings, so like small forward, center, point guard. Okay, so it might be different from the spreadsheet because the spreadsheet is a very, very objective analysis, and then my personal opinion is a subjective analysis, obviously. So, all right, we're gonna start with John Havlicek. So John Havlicek, I think, is one of the most underrated players of all time. He's ranked number 16 on my all-time list and number 7 on my small forwards list. So I'm going to go through his achievements. I'm going to go through all these guys' achievements. He's a 13-time All-Star, 11-time All-NBA. He's actually 8-time All-Defensive, but I'm going to put 14-time All-Defensive here because they're all-defensive selections. They came in 1969, and Havlicek obviously started his career before then, and I think he would have gotten a few more all-defensive selections. So I just went ahead and gave him 14-time all-defensive selections. So if you give him that, he's actually, yeah, one of the best, like top 20, definitely a top 20 player all time. And he's 8-0 in the finals, and that's the best finals record of all time. That's better than Michael Jordan. You know, a lot of people talk about Michael Jordan having a 6-0 finals record. John Havlicek, Hondo Havlicek, has an 8-0 record in the finals, which is incredibly impressive. One-time finals MVP, averaged 21, 6, and 5 in his career. He's a very, very well-rounded player. Most people don't talk about John Havlicek as much as they should. Like, I almost never hear his name brought up by sports analysts at all. Even in small forward discussions, like when people talk about the greatest small forwards of all time, they almost always put Scottie Pippen ahead of John Havlicek, and I don't understand why. Scottie Pippen, okay, he was second banana for most of his career. He has a 6-0 finals record, just like Jordan, obviously. Great defender. But if you compare him to John Havlicek, Hondo has more All-Star selections, more All-NBA selections. If you add those all-defensive selections that he should have had at the beginning of his career, he has more all-defensive selections than Pippen does. He has a better finals record. He has a finals MVP, which Pippen doesn't have, because Pippen was always a second banana. Hondo had two parts to his career, right? The first part of his career, he was the second banana to Bill Russell. But the second half of his career, he was actually an alpha dog. He was the leader of the Celtics during the 70s. So he had two parts to his career, and his stats are better too, in pretty much every way. So I would say there's no reason to put Scottie Pippen ahead of John Havlicek. And it's a travesty that all these sports shows and analysts and sports magazines, they all have Scottie Pippen ahead of John Havlicek. And I don't understand why, because by all accounts and measures, if you want to talk about stats, if you want to talk about awards, if you want to talk about just general impact on the game, like even clutch, right? Hondo's one of the most clutch players ever. Like Havlicek steals the ball, remember that? They should have John Havlicek ahead of Scottie Pippen. That's not to say Scottie Pippen is not one of the great small forwards. He is. But John Havlicek should be up before him, right? There's no area in which Scottie Pippen is better than John Havlicek in, right? So that's why I think he's really underrated, because the fact that he's not really brought up in the small forwards. There was even I think Slam did like one of their Mount Rushmore small forwards and stuff like that. It's like, who would you pick from these guys to be in your Mount Rushmore? And they picked like 12 small forwards on that list. And I saw Carmelo Anthony and Paul Pierce in that list, no John Havlicek, no Rick Barry. And I was like, what the heck? Like, do these guys even know their sports history? They have Elgin Baylor, right? Which is good, but they don't have John Havlicek. They don't have Rick Barry in that list. They have Carmelo Anthony in that list. I mean, wow. That's how you know it's John Havlicek and Hondo Havlicek. That's how you know he's underrated. The fact that people completely forget about him in these, even in those kind of lists and discussions by sports magazines and sports analysts, that's crazy. Why is he underrated? I'm going to do this for each player. Why do that? Why do I think that they're underrated? I think Hondo's underrated because he played in the 60s and the 70s, and I think the 70s in general gets very underrated by people and just by in general. I think by even by the NBA. I think they don't really talk about the 70s. Players, fans don't talk about it. Players don't talk about it. Sports analysts don't talk about it. Just the 70s in general, I think, is the most underrated decade because it just gets left out of so many discussions and the players just don't want to talk about it. I think in a way, the ABA and the NBA in this 1970s are both discredited because of the lack of competition, right? And I think that's really like even compared to the 60s, because people talk about the 60s, they talk about Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell, obviously not as much as the modern era, but people do talk about the 60s about Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell, Oscar West, right? They don't talk about the 70s as much as the 60s. And I think the ABA has something to do with it. Like, they don't talk about the ABA either, right? So the ABA is underrated, and then the NBA in the 70s is also underrated. So because of that, I think because the leagues were split into the level of competition, people say we're lower in the 70s. So that's why they don't really bring up the 70s a lot. And players that played the majority of their career in the 70s or their prime in the 70s often get really underrated and forgotten. That's why a lot of my players on this list are going to be from the 70s. So Havlicek, another victim of that. First of all, because he played as a second banana in the 60s, and then he became a leader in Alpha Dog in the 70s, which makes him easy to get forgotten. So I think that's why he's underrated. Just 70s players in general are underrated, right? So that's why. And then Artis Gilmore, he's ranked number 20 on my all-time list and number 8 on my all-time centers list. 11-time All-Star, 5-time All-NBA, 5-time All-Defensive. I'm going to say All-NBA and ABA. 5-time All-Defensive, 1-time MVP, 1-time champion, 1-time Finals MVP. This was in the ABA, of course. Averaged 19, 12, and 2 in his career. Artis Gilmore is not brought up as much as he should be. Definitely, like, he's really, really underrated. If people want to talk about underrated centers, they usually mention Hakeem Olajuwon, they mention Moses Malone, they mention David Robinson maybe when you're talking about underrated centers. But these people don't really know how underrated you are until you get to Artis Gilmore, okay? Because how many people talk about Artis Gilmore, right? He should be in the top 10 centers of all time when you include his ABA career, because he was probably second best ABA player of all time, right next to Julius Erving. And he was like people call him the Wilt of the ABA. He was just so dominant in that league. And to show you how dominant he was, he holds the highest field goal percentage and true shooting percentage of all time at 62.3%. He has the highest field goal percentage and true shooting percentage of all time, right? So he was the most efficient player of all time. And he's top 10 in win shares on the all-time list. He's ahead of guys like Hakeem, Robinson, and Moses. He's ahead of all those guys in win shares, and he's not talked about any of those guys. Like, if you want to take any of those guys, like Artis Gilmore is not talked about even a fraction as much as those guys are, right? And I know you want to talk about like even Nate Thurmond or Willis Reed or Dave Cowens, Wes Unseld. You want to talk about those guys being underrated too. Artis Gilmore isn't mentioned even as much as those guys. Like, that tells you how underrated Artis Gilmore is. He's number 5 on the all-time combined ABA NBA rebounding list. He led the league in rebounding 4 times, and he was just a dominant center. And it's crazy he's not mentioned very much at all. I think people who have seen him play would rank him very high, but I think he's underrated because he played in the 1970s for most of his prime, right? And he played his prime in the ABA, and this is kind of like a double dosage of underratedness, because people are not going to respect the 1970s. They don't talk about that decade. And on top of that, he played in the ABA, which people don't really talk about either. They think the ABA was, a weak league, right? People underrate the ABA because they think it's not competitive as the NBA. And then the NBA wasn't competitive either in the 70s. So you kind of had that double dosage there. So that's why Artis Gilmore, I think he's forgotten. I think if he played his entire career in the NBA, he'd be a lot more remembered. But even then, just playing the 70s is kind of like a, yeah, like anyone who played in the 70s is kind of underrated in general, except for Kareem. Kareem is the one that kind of got out because he played in the 80s too. But and Dr. J because he also played in the 80s. But for most of the guys that played in the prime in the 70s, they're pretty much forgotten. So yeah, Artis Gilmore definitely a top 10 center of all time based on his achievements and his stats. I mean, he's got all these records, right? Like the highest field goal percentage of all time and number 5 on the all-time rebounding list, and then top 10 win shares. And people don't really talk about him. So if you want to talk about underrated centers, talk about Artis Gilmore, right? He's a top 20 player all time according to my list. All right, and second on my underrated list is Bob Pettit. He's ranked number 18 on my all-time list and number 4 on my all-time power forwards list. Just look at his accolades. I mean, a lot of these guys are also mentioned in my previous video as well, and Pettit was also on that list, but people don't realize just how good Pettit was. He's probably the best white player from the 1950s, I would say. Yeah, he's better than George Mikan. He's better than Bob Cousy. He's probably the best white player from the 1950s, and that's pretty amazing. He's 11-time All-Star, 4-time All-Star MVP, tied with Kobe for the most all-time, by the way. 11-time All-NBA. And he only played 11 seasons, so that means that he was All-NBA every season of his career, which is pretty amazing. He has 1 ring. He's actually the only person to ever beat Bill Russell's Celtics in the finals. I gave him 1 Finals MVP because I know they didn't have Finals MVP back then, but he should have got it in 1958 because he put up 50 points in the clinching game, right, which was a record at the time. And then he has 2 MVPs. He's actually the inaugural MVP. The first time the NBA actually awarded it, he was the first MVP. And 2-time scoring leader, 1-time rebounding leader, and his stats are just pretty insane. 26, 16, and 3 for his career. He never averaged below 20 points a game in his career. So if you want to talk about crazy stats, people usually think about Wilt, they think about Oscar, Elgin Baylor maybe, for people who know a bit more about basketball. But even then, like Bob Pettit isn't brought up that much, and he should be, because 26 and 16 is insane. And he did this as, he wasn't like some ahead of his time super athletic guy like Wilt was, right? He was a 6'9" white dude from the 1950s, and he averaged 16 rebounds a game. Like, that is incredible, right? When you think about it, it's not that surprising that Elgin Baylor, he averaged 13.5 rebounds a game because he was a super crazy athletic black dude playing in a league that was still full of majority of white people, right? But Bob Pettit was a white guy, right? So you can't even say that he was ahead of his competition because he was the same as them, right? But despite the fact, he still averaged 16 rebounds a game. He's still, like, the second best white dude in his era was probably Dolph Schayes, right? Or Bob Cousy, right? And he still, I think definitely for his position, his main competition was Dolph Schayes. But his stats just blow Dolph Schayes out of the water even. And Dolph Schayes is an underrated player that I'll talk about in this video as well. But Bob Pettit just blew Dolph Schayes out of the water, and that goes to show, how great he was. And he is really underrated. He's hardly ever mentioned in the all-time power forwards discussion, especially by analysts, right? Modern analysts and fans. They don't talk about Bob Pettit all that much. And they just skip him, right? They just say, oh, who are the best power forwards? There's obviously Tim Duncan, Karl Malone, Charles Barkley, Kevin Garnett, Dirk Nowitzki. And they just skip Bob Pettit, right? Maybe because I think he's underrated because he played in the 1950s. And he also played in the 1960s too, but he kind of retired in the middle of it. And I don't think people really pay attention to the 50s or even to the 60s all that much unless you put up like really, really insane stats like Wilt did, or you win 11 titles like Bill Russell did. Like, those are things that are so improbable that you have to talk about them. Or Oscar Robertson averaging a triple-double. Those are things that are just so improbable that you have to talk about it, right? But Bob Pettit didn't do any of that. Even though he had insane numbers, he didn't average 50 points a game. He didn't average a triple-double. He didn't win 11 titles. So he's not going to be brought up like those guys are. But he was still a really, really good player. So he's, I just think he's underrated because he played in the 50s and 60s, and his name wasn't Wilt, Russell, Oscar, or West. So, Yeah, unfortunately, everyone who's not who didn't do something really insane like that or broke some insane record is not going to be really mentioned from the 50s and 60s. And then next I have Bob Cousy, who's ranked number 21 on my all-time list right after Pettit. Number 4 PG all-time on my list, 13-time All-Star, 12-time All-NBA, 8-time assist leader. That's the second most assist titles all-time after John Stockton. He has 6 rings. That's the exact same amount as Kareem, exact same amount as Jordan. 2 MVPs. He actually technically only won one, but in Bill Simmons' Book of Basketball, he gave an extra MVP to Bob Cousy in 1955, which I think he should have had. So, anyways, 2 MVPs is what I have for him. He averaged 18, 5, and 7.5 for his career, so he's a pretty well-rounded point guard. I think Bob Cousy deserves to be higher in the all-time point guards list. People don't really talk about him. They usually have him maybe on the list like near the end, like maybe number 10 or past number 10, maybe in their top 20. Yeah, I don't think that you can dispute Bob Cousy's impact on the game. He was definitely the most popular player of the 1950s, maybe after George Mikan retired. I think he was more popular than Bob Pettit, just because he played in Boston, right? Even though Bob Pettit, I have him ranked a little bit higher as the prototypical power forward from the 1950s. Bob Cousy was the prototypical PG, the point guard, and he set the standard for what the position should be like, much like how George Mikan did for the centers and Pettit did for the power forwards. And he should be ranked higher, like just based off of his achievements, his stats, his accolades alone, he should be ranked in the top 30, right? But most people don't think about Bob Cousy all that much. And the reason he's underrated is, again, because he played in the 1950s. And players who play in the 1950s tend not to be well remembered today. So, Bob Cousy, again, I think is pretty underrated. And he's in my top 30. Chris Paul. I have Chris Paul ranked number 25 on my all-time list, number 5 PG all-time. And you might be wondering, why is Chris Paul here? Because he's a pretty modern player, right? And, in our current day and age, modern players should be actually ranked favorably because of recency bias, right? Because I know the ESPN list that came out, they put Curry, like number 11 all time or something, which is something crazy like that. And they put all these recent players like Giannis, they put Harden, they put Giannis, they put Harden, they put Kawhi and AD ahead of guys like Bob Pettit and John Havlicek. And that to me is insane because that means the recency bias has gone to the point where we put these guys like 30 spots ahead of where they should be, right? That's crazy to me. But for Chris Paul, I think it went the other direction because I think his achievements is actually more than what people think. And I think he gets a bad rep because of the fact that he didn't win a ring and he didn't go to the finals. And I think that really weighs on his reputation a lot. So, I mean, if you look at his awards, accolades, and stats, they're insane. Like, he's a 10-time All-Star, 8-time All-NBA, 9-time All-Defensive, 4-time assist leader, 6-time steals leader, averaged 18.5, 4.5, 9.5 in his career, which, by the way, 9.5 is the third highest assist average all time. Number 7 all time in assists. Like, Chris Paul has his accolades are insane, right? He has enormous amount of awards, accolades, both offensive and defensive, and as a prototypical point guard, right, who's a playmaker who averages a lot of assists, leads the league in assists. He's up there with John Stockton, right? But for some reason, people don't like Chris Paul. I don't know, like modern fans, they tend to underrate Chris Paul because I think it's just the fact that he never made a finals. He came very close to making a finals in 2018, but he got injured, and people focus too much on his lack of a ring and his unluckiness in the playoffs. I think he's one of the most decorated players that doesn't have a ring, right? He's one of the best players not to win a ring, and I think people focus too much on the fact that he doesn't have one. But if you look at every other thing, right, his awards, his stats, and everything is like, you couldn't ask for a better point guard, right? That's why I have Chris Paul in my top 5 PGs all time, ahead of Curry, ahead of Isaiah Thomas. I know, which is going to piss some people off, but yeah, I have CP3 ahead of I have CP3 ahead of Steph Curry and Isaiah Thomas, believe it or not. So, yeah, I just think that people, they focus too much on the negative aspects of Chris Paul's career, which is really just not having a ring. and they don't value his achievements as much as they should have. If you put his achievements in context, compared to all other great players, he's up there in the top 25 all time, right? He's basically Kidd's defense uh, combined with Nash's offense in having the playmaking abilities of both, right? So I think Chris Paul is underrated, even though he's a recent player. Next up, I have Rick Barry, also from a previous video. Rick Barry, he's ranked number 29 on my all-time list, number 6 on my SF list, and yeah, number 6 on my all-time small forwards list. His achievements, he's a 12-time All-Star, and I'm combining his ABA achievements here as well. 10-time All-NBA ABA. He has 2 rings, if you count his ring in the ABA. His 1-time Finals MVP, averaged 25, 7, and 5 for his career, which is pretty insane. I think Rick Barry is a very polarizing superstar. He's obviously one of the best scorers of all time. He has the highest final scoring average of all time, even higher than Michael Jordan at 35 points per game. He has the 7th highest playoff scoring average of all time at 27 points per game. He's one of the few NBA superstars to lead a team to a championship without another All-Star. So the only other ones are Hakeem Olajuwon in 1994 and 1995, Ben Wallace in 2004, and Dirk Nowitzki in 2011, which everyone likes to talk about. But Rick Barry did this first in 1975. He did this without any other All-Star, and he beat a very stacked team, a team that was very favored in the finals. He beat Wes Unseld and Elvin Hayes, and he swept them. So it's not just beat them, he swept them. Yeah, I think he's underrated. He's not mentioned, and I think ESPN, I think they put their list of all-time Golden State Warriors, and Rick Barry wasn't on that list. And I was so shocked about this. That's beyond disrespectful not to have Rick Barry on the all-time Golden State Warriors list. I mean, come on. They put Draymond Green instead of Rick Barry on that list. And I was shocked. I was like, in what world is Draymond Green better than Rick Barry, right? Rick Barry is, people don't, I think he's underrated because, again, he played in the 60s and the 70s. He spent part of his prime in the ABA, and he wasn't well liked by other players. So that's probably why he's so underrated, but still, like, you got to look at his achievements here. Like, in his second year in the league as a sophomore, he averaged 36 points a game and 10 rebounds. He took the Warriors all the way to the finals. He outscored Wilt Chamberlain in the finals. He scored, 41 points a game in that finals? He did this in his second season in the league. He outscored Wilt Chamberlain. It took him to the finals. And then he took a team that didn't have another All-Star all the way to a championship, and they don't even put him on the all-time Golden State Warriors list. That's just so disrespectful, right? I can't believe they put they put Draymond Green on the list instead of Rick Barry, and they say, oh, we wanted to have Rick Barry and Chris Smalling on the list, but they didn't make it. You can't even compare Rick Barry and Chris Smalling, okay? That is so disrespectful, so disrespectful to Rick Barry to compare him to Chris Smalling. I mean, I don't think they realized how great of a player Rick Barry was. He was also probably the first point forward. Just amazing competitive player, and even like years later after he retired, he still played like 100%, 110% on the court. Just one of the most competitive players ever. I really think that if not for his if he didn't spend part of his prime in the ABA, or like in the 70s, he spent most of his prime, I think, in the early 70s in the ABA. If he wasn't such a prickly person, like he wasn't well liked by his own teammates even. He's just a brutally honest person. That cost him a lot of MVPs. I think he was robbed of a few MVPs because MVPs were voted on by players back then. I think it cost him a few MVPs that the fact that he was so he was so competitive, and he was so brutally honest. I think that it cost him a lot of those things, and that's part of the reason why he's so underrated, I think. And he gets left out a lot of these conversations. They rank him below Scottie Pippen. They don't put him on the Golden State Warriors all-time list. Like, it's just nuts. Anyways, that's Rick Barry, underrated, of course. I have next Dwight Howard. Dwight Howard ranked number 31 on my all-time list, number 10 center of all time. And same thing with Chris Paul here. You might be wondering why I have Dwight Howard on here. He's a modern player that's still playing. Well, the reason is I also think he's underrated by modern fans and analysts because of what happened later in his career. Like, Dwight Howard was really, really good. He was dominant, the most dominant center after Shaq. He led a team of ragtag spot-up shooters to the finals, And number 14 all-time rebounds. I'm going to list his accolades actually right now. 8-time All-Star, 6-time All-NBA, 5-time rebound leader, 2-time blocks leader, 3-time Defensive Player of the Year, averaged 17-21. Sorry, not 17-12, not 21, 17-12 throughout his career. And those are still really, really good stats. And yeah, I just think he's underrated because of this recency bias in the other direction. So most superstars benefit from recency bias. Like, Kevin Durant gets ranked higher, Giannis gets ranked higher, AD, they all get ranked higher. Damian Lillard even made the list of ESPN's top 75 players, even though I don't think Damian Lillard belongs in the top 75 at all. But they put him on that list. Recency bias usually affects players positively, but for Chris Paul and Dwight Howard, it affects them negatively because people focus on what happened later in his career after Orlando. They focus on the fact that he got injured, and then they focus on his mentality, his lack of a work ethic, his lack of rings, obviously. So they focus on those negative aspects, and because of that, they underrate him. So if you look at just his achievements in a vacuum, just like with Chris Paul, you got to look at their achievements in a vacuum because that's how I'm doing this for every other player here, right? I'm not trying to put them, not trying to talk about their mentality or whatever. I'm just looking at their achievements. If you look at Dwight Howard's achievements in a vacuum, he's the top 10 center all time, and there's no doubt about it. I mean, look at that. Just like his All-Star appearances, All-NBA, his rebound, the times he led in blocks and rebounds. He was one of the best defensive players of his time. And yeah, just his stats and awards and accolades, they if you look at him in a vacuum and don't think about his mentality or lack of rings or whatever, like even without all that, just look at his accolades in a vacuum and his stats in a vacuum. He should be in the top 40 of all time, right? And ESPN left Dwight Howard out of their top 75 list. I'm not kidding. They left Dwight Howard out of their top 75 list. They have Damian Lillard in there. They don't have Dwight Howard in there. That's insane to me, right? Like, Dwight Howard, by all measures, right? Whether you want to go for awards, stats, achievements, like even without a ring, a lot of good players don't have a ring, right? Patrick Ewing doesn't have a ring. Allen Iverson doesn't have a ring. Charles Barkley doesn't have a ring. Karl Malone doesn't have a ring. John Stockton doesn't have a ring. A lot of good players don't have a ring. Okay, so let's not just say because Dwight Howard doesn't have a ring. Chris Paul doesn't have a ring either, right? Dwight Howard should be at the top. He should definitely be in the top 75 all time. And ESPN left him out of their top 75, which is insane to me. So that's why I think Dwight Howard is really underrated. I think people focus too much on his off the court issues, like his lack of mentality, lack of work ethic and stuff. They don't focus on what he did on the court, and that's why he's underrated in my opinion. He should be a top 10 center all time. He should be a top 40 player all time. And people, yeah, they don't like Dwight Howard, so he's become really underrated. That's why I have him on this list, even though he's a modern player. All right, next up, I have Elgin Baylor. I have Elgin Baylor lower than John Havlicek and Rick Barry because I feel like he still gets brought up in conversations because people do. He got a statue in the Staples Center, I think, not that long ago. So people are starting to recognize him. He used to be very underrated for a very long time, but now he's started to get more recognition compared to before, I think. He's ranked number 33 on my all-time list, number 5 on my SF's all-time small forward list, 11-time All-Star, 10-time All-NBA, 27, 13.5, and 4 for his career, which are insane stats. Like I said, he's the next statistical monster of the 1960s. After Wilt, after Oscar Robertson, Jerry West, and Elgin Baylor. I think those are the... Bob Pettit, right, belongs in that list as well, but I think Elgin Baylor is definitely in there for the most ridiculous statistical monsters. He averaged 38 and 18 while playing part-time for the NBA while serving in the military. He once scored 71 points in a game. He still holds the finals record for scoring 61 points in a finals game. One of the first guys to play above the rim. And yeah, he was very, very underrated for a very long time. And I had him in my previous video as well. But I think in the recent years, more and more people started to recognize him a little bit more. So he's still underrated. He still gets left out of a lot of conversations, just not as much as before. That's why I think John Havlicek and Rick Barry are more underrated than Elgin Baylor. But still, I think he's still underrated. So that's why I have him on this list. And I think he's underrated because he never won an MVP in his career. So same with Jerry West. I think Elgin Baylor should have won an MVP. And Jerry West should have won an MVP. But I don't know. MVP was voted on by players back then, and that's why Bill Russell won a lot, even though Bill Russell didn't have the best stats. But he did win a lot of MVPs because his team was just the best most of the time, right? He just missed out on a ring, so he was very unlucky. He was 0-8 in the finals. If you want to focus on finals records, Elgin Baylor probably has the most unlucky finals record, 0-8 in the finals. A lot of those are just really unlucky things, right? And you might say that, oh, maybe it's because Bill Russell's just really clutch, and he is. Bill Russell is really clutch, but I think luck had to play a factor in some of those finals appearances, right? So I think Elgin Baylor definitely got the short end, and Jerry West, right? Jerry West and Elgin Baylor got the short end of the stick in a lot of those finals. They really missed. They really got unlucky. He got injured, like 6 seasons in his career, and Jerry West took over after that. So his career, his prime was incredibly dominant, but he didn't have a very long prime. I think that's part of the reason why he's underrated as well. Just missed out on a ring, right? That 72 Lakers with a 33 game winning streak and winning a ring, he retired just before that happened. So he's probably one of the best players never to win a ring, along with Chris Paul, I think. I think my best players never to win a ring are Karl Malone, Elgin Baylor, Charles Barkley, and Chris Paul. Those would be my top Mount Rushmore of players never to win a ring. So, and John Stockton as well, if you want to go top 5. So yeah, I think, yeah, Elgin Baylor is probably underrated because of that. Most people don't know that Elgin Baylor is the reason why the LA Lakers continue to exist as a franchise, because they weren't making much money after George Mikan retired, and this is in Minneapolis. He was drafted while he was still in while the franchise was still in Minneapolis, and he pretty much saved that franchise from bankruptcy. So Elgin Baylor saved the Lakers from bankruptcy, and still to this day, he's never really mentioned in the all-time Lakers list. Like, in the all-time Lakers list, you probably see Kobe Bryant, Magic Johnson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, right? Shaq, maybe Jerry West. And I think Jerry West should actually be the GOAT Laker because of what he did as an executive, but that's a different discussion. And maybe even James Worthy, but you never hear about Elgin Baylor that much, and he really should be in that all-time Lakers list. He saved that franchise from bankruptcy. Anyways, that's Elgin Baylor. Next up, I have Dolph Schayes, who I alluded to in my Bob Pettit discussion already. He's ranked number 34 on my all-time list, number 8 PF all-time, 12-time All-Star, 12-time All-NBA, 1 ring. I gave him a Finals MVP in 1955. They didn't have it back then, but he should have got it. 18, 12, and 3 for his career. Again, I think Dolph Schayes is he's underrated because he played in the 1950s, just like with Bob Pettit. And like I said, he's a lesser version of Bob Pettit. He definitely wasn't as dominant as Bob Pettit was. But still, like, if you just look at his achievements and stats in a vacuum, which I'm doing for all these players, that's how I'm being unbiased here, right? I'm not talking about the intangible stuff is really hard to get, right? Because unless you were there watching the player, you really don't know about their intangibles, right? And there's really no way to judge all these players except by their accolades and stats, right? That's what we have. You can't go back in time and look at all these players and then, try to judge their intangibles and stuff like that. That's why some players might be higher ranked or lower ranked than you might expect. But for me, that's how I'm making this fair for all these players. I'm just judging them based on their accolades and achievements and stats that they did on the court. So anyways, by those standards, I think Dolph Schayes is a top 40 player all time. A 12-time All-NBA player. I mean, how could you not put that in your top 40? But again, with the ESPN list again, they have that top 75 list, and Dolph Schayes was omitted from that list. So again, this just like with Dwight Howard and a lot of other players, like, yeah, ESPN just didn't have they didn't have Paul Harrison, they didn't have Sam Jones, they didn't have a lot of players on the list either. But Dolph Schayes was one of the most notable omissions as well. So he definitely should be in the top 75 players all time, I think. Like 12-time All-NBA, like, say what you will about 1950s, you might be saying that, oh, it's uncompetitive, they wouldn't be able to play today, and stuff like that. I don't care about this era comparison stuff, right? Like, if we're always going to be comparing eras, then the current era is always going to be better than the era before it. And basically, you can just take the most recent players of the current era, and those are the best players ever, right? And that's not really right. We don't do that in other sports, right? We don't say Babe Ruth couldn't play in today's game. We don't say Gordie Howe couldn't play in today's game, or Muhammad Ali can't box in today. Like, we have to judge them based on their era. right? So if you judge them based on their era, Dolph Schayes should be in that discussion. 12-time All-NBA is definitely top 75 all time. It's actually top 40 all time, right? So he redefined the forward positions in the 50s, just like with Pettit. His jumper, his set shot probably would not translate today as well as Pettit's. But anyways, if we're just judging them based on their era, then I think Dolph Schayes should be up there. And I think George Mikan in a way is underrated as well because he dominated his era as well. But I'm gonna put Dolph Schayes and Bob Pettit ahead of there because I do think there were better players than George Mikan, and they actually kind of played in the same era. So that's why I don't have George Mikan on this list, even though he was dominant. But the fact that he played so early, I think Pettit and Schayes were better than Mikan, right, as players. And I actually can compare them because they all played in the 1950s, right? Their number, Dolph Schayes' number is not retired by the 76ers for whatever reason. He played in the Syracuse Nationals, I know, but still, the 76ers are the successor organization, right? Just like how the Kings, the Sacramento Kings, retired Oscar Robertson's number because they're the successor to the Cincinnati Royals, then I think the 76ers should retire Dolph Schayes' number because it's the successor to the Syracuse Nationals, right? Anyways, yeah, underrated because he played in the 50s, and even less, if Bob Pettit's not going to be remembered, then Dolph Schayes definitely not going to be remembered. Next up, I have Walt Frazier. Walt Frazier is ranked number 36 on my all-time list, number 7 PG all-time. His accolades: 7-time All-Star, 6-time All-NBA, 9-time All-Defensive, 2 rings, 19-6-6 in his career. Probably should have gotten Finals MVP in 1970 instead of Willis Reed. He's one of the best he's one of the 2 best defensive point guards of all time, along with Gary Payton, 2 players of all time. Yeah, I think Walt Frazier definitely. He is brought up in the greatest point guards discussion, just near towards the bottom, right? He gets maybe like the 10, 11, 12 spot is where people put him, and really I think he should be higher than that. The reason is because he's such a good defender. I put him 9-time all defensive because he should have got 2 more, but this was before because he started before 1969, right? But yeah, I think he gets left out a lot of discussions, maybe because he played in the 70s. Again, this is the whole problem of playing the 70s. The 70s really gets left out. That's probably why Walt Frazier's forgotten. He also had kind of a short career. That's probably why. But I think at the time, if you're talking about point guards or just guards in the 1970s, I think Walt Frazier was probably the best guard in the 70s. I don't think Pete Maravich was better. I don't think Earl Monroe was better. I don't think Tiny Archibald was better. I think Walt Frazier was far and away the best guard of the 70s. And yeah, he should be remembered better. Like, he's just a great two-way player and great clutch player as well. And I have him ranked ahead of Isaiah Thomas, which a lot of people might not like. But if you look at it, they both have 2 rings. They both led their dynasties, right? A really great team. And honestly, I think Walt Frazier as a player, he's a better rebounder, maybe not as good of a passer, but a more efficient player, definitely. I think there's a good argument for him being ahead of Isaiah Thomas, and he's a much better defender as well. So that's why I have him ranked ahead. And everyone has Isaiah Thomas in their top 5, and Walt Frazier is all the way down at like the 10 or 11 or 12 spot, and that's really not fair, because I think if you compare Walt Frazier and Isaiah Thomas's careers, I think Walt Frazier actually comes ahead, right? So that's why he's underrated. But yeah, I think Walt Frazier should definitely be ranked higher on the all-time point guards list. A lot of people rank him in the top, like maybe number 10, number 11, number 12. He should definitely be more like number 7. If you look at all his accolades, achievements, especially given the two-way side of his career, if you account for defense, like I'm accounting for defense now, if you look at offense and defense, the combination, the whole package, and if you look at his rebounding stats and his assist stats and just his all-around stats, I think Walt Frazier should definitely be ranked higher than he usually is. So yeah, it's Walt Frazier. And then next on my list is Mel Daniels. Mel Daniels ranked number 38 on my all-time list. I have him as my number 11 center all-time. He's also in my previous video as well. 7-time All-Star, 5-time All-ABA, 3-time rebounding leader, 3 rings, 2 MVPs, averaged 18, 15, and 2 for his career. He's one of the top 3 ABA players of all time. He's the all-time ABA leading rebounder. I would consider his career to be similar to Willis Reed, except he was in the ABA. And I didn't put Willis Reed on this list because I don't think that he's as underrated as I thought he was. He's just properly rated. He's not. I mean, he's not overrated, obviously, because people don't bring out his name or anything. But I don't think he's like extremely underrated like these guys are. But I think that Mel Daniels is really underrated. People don't really bring up his name. People don't even know him actually. A lot of basketball fans don't know him, and it's really sad because he led that dynasty. And if you look at that Pacers dynasty in the ABA, that was 4 finals and 3 rings in 4 years, right? Sorry, 3 rings in 4 years, and they went to 4 finals total. Yeah, and that's very similar to the Golden State Warriors dynasty that we had recently. And you can think of, if you look at his achievements, right, 3 rings, 2 MVPs, that's actually the same as Steph Curry. And averaging 18, 15, 2 of his career, again, very similar to Willis Reed. His accolades, All Star, All NBA, that stuff is very similar to Dave Cowens or Willis Reed, and isn't nearly brought up as much as Willis Reed or Dave Cowens is, and definitely not brought up as much as Steph Curry is. So yeah, I think just the fact that he played in the ABA, he spent his entire career there, is why he's so forgotten, and he really shouldn't be, because I know that people like to put down the ABA and say that, oh, they're uncompetitive, and that's why a lot of people don't they discredit ABA players, because they're like, oh, it's an uncompetitive league. Well, there's a lot of really great players that came from the ABA, right? Dr. J, obviously, George Gervin, David Thompson, right? Dan Issel and Artis Gilmore went to have some pretty decent careers in the NBA, and Connie Hawkins, Spencer Haywood, right? There's a few more. There's some pretty good players. George McGinnis, right, that played in the ABA, and of course his stats went down after they played in the NBA, but a lot of them still found great success. A lot of them were still all-stars. So the top players of the ABA were still all-star level in the NBA, right? They just had kind of inflated stats in the ABA, but it's still fairly competitive. It's not like as uncompetitive as people think. I would say it's like the ABA was maybe almost on par with the NBA by the time it merged. So at the beginning, the ABA wasn't very competitive, but by the end, I would say 74, 75, 76, the ABA was actually pretty competitive, right? It was about 80% as competitive as the NBA, and that's still pretty good. So I think Mel Daniels should definitely get his fair recognition, and the fact that the Hall of Fame just inducted him like 5 years ago, or 6 years ago or something, and he really should have been a first ballot inductor, right? First ballot inductee, right? Because I mean, look at it, all-time ABA rebounder, 3 rings, 2 MVPs, leader of a dynasty. Uh, he should have been inducted, the same way Willis Reed was inducted as soon as he retired, right? He really was the Willis Reed of the ABA. So I definitely think that Mel Daniels should have been remembered more, just given his accolades and his stats. Like, yeah, he definitely belongs in the top 40 all time. And of course, modern analysts and fans don't really know him. And even in Bill Simmons' book, never even mentioned him, right? Bill Simmons' book never mentioned Mel Daniels. Obviously, ESPN, all these other sports websites don't mention Mel Daniels at all. It's completely forgotten because he spent his whole career in the ABA, which is really unfortunate. Okay, so Dan Issel I have next. Ranked number 49 on my all-time list, number 10 PF all-time. 6-time All-Star, 5-time All-ABA, 1 ring, averaged 23, 9, and 2 for his career. Thing about Dan Issel is he didn't play as well in the NBA. I think he was still a top star in the NBA. He just wasn't the same as he was in the ABA. When he was in the ABA, he was one of the top 5 players there. Right? He was, I would say in terms of his mentality, he was like a Dave Cowens. He had a lot of heart, a lot of fierce competitive hustle, I would say. In that sense, he was similar to Dave Cowens. Even though they played differently, Dave Cowens was more of a rebounder. Dan Issel more of a scorer than Cowens was. But still, I would say they had the same kind of hustle. And yeah, I think Issel should definitely be mentioned among the greatest players. And unfortunately, he just isn't. And because I think he played in the 70s. Again, he played his prime in the ABA. But most people don't realize on the combined NBA-ABA scoring list, which I think the NBA should really acknowledge the ABA stats and awards and records, but they don't, which is sad. That's why a lot of these ABA players get forgotten, like Mel Daniels. But anyways, if you look at the combined NBA-ABA scoring list, he's actually number 11. He's just outside the top 10. on the scoring list. So given those achievements, Dan Issel should definitely be brought up more, right? The fact that he scored that many points, if you look at how many points he scored, Issel scored 27,000 points combined, right? 27,000. Like, he should really be, his name should really be brought up more. And it's unfortunate that he isn't. He's on my top 10 power forward list. He's on my top 50 all time. But of course, he's left out of a lot of conversations. I'm glad that Bill Simmons had him in his book, but ESPN left him out of the top 75, which is a travesty. Dan Issel is definitely a top 75 player all time. And anyone who saw Dan Issel play can attest to the fact that, yeah, he's basically the Dave Cowens of the ABA. He should definitely be in that list. Right, next up, I have George McGinnis. George McGinnis ranked number 51 on my all-time list, number 11 on my power forward all-time list. 6-time All-Star, 5-time All-ABA, 2 rings, 1 MVP, 1 Finals MVP, all in the ABA, of course. Averaged 20, 11, and 4 for his career. So his stats actually look kind of similar to Chris Webber's stats, doesn't it? So he averaged 20, 11, and 4, so he's a really good passer from the power forward position, just like Webber was. But even though his stats look similar to Chris Webber, I think his play style, a lot of people who saw him play would say that he's like a prototype of LeBron James, actually. He was like the prototype LeBron in the fact that he did like everything on the court. He scored, he rebounded, he passed, and he had that physical domination that LeBron had, driving to the basket. He had a really unique jumper too, the one-handed jumper. And it's really unfortunate that his career is really overlooked because he, again, played his prime in the ABA. But he was also part of the 76ers, and he went all the way to the finals in the NBA as well, right? He played in the 76ers, and they went to the finals with Dr. J in 1977. Lost to the Blazers, of course. But he played pretty well in the NBA for a few years before he started getting injured. So it's also the fact that his career was kind of short. But he retired, I think, only like at 31 or 32. So he retired pretty early. But definitely, I think he's a Hall of Fame player for sure. And he's just outside my top 50. And he didn't get inducted until the Hall of Fame until like 2 years ago, which is a travesty again. Like, the Hall of Fame did not induct a lot of these ABA players until like way later than they should have. Artis Gilmore, for example, that one, number 2 on my underrated list, like he didn't get inducted until, what, 2012? Like, that's way later than when he should have been inducted, right? So George McGinnis, very underrated. Wasn't in Bill Simmons' book. Obviously wasn't in the ESPN all-time list either. Definitely one of my he's in my top 12 power forwards all time. And I think more people should really take a look at George McGinnis, especially when he had his prime in the ABA. He was a beast. He was, if you want to call him the LeBron of the ABA, the same way I called Mel Daniels the Willis Reed of the ABA, the Artis Gilmore the Wilt of the ABA, and Dan Issel the Dave Cowens of the ABA, you can say that. He's you can say he was kind of the LeBron of the ABA. So yeah, very underrated player. Not many people know about George McGinnis. Next up on my list, I have Spencer Haywood, ranked number 58 on my all-time list, number 12, right after George McGinnis on my power forward all-time. And his stats and awards are pretty similar to George McGinnis, actually. 5-time All-Star, 5-time All-ABA, or NBA, so he actually played more in the NBA than the ABA. 1 ring, 1 MVP, averaged 20, 10, and 2 for his career. So his stats and awards look very similar to George McGinnis. I would say that he's not as good as George McGinnis in one area, which is his passing. George McGinnis was definitely a better passer. So the LeBron comparison doesn't really work for Haywood. He's, I think Haywood was he was definitely more of an interior player than McGinnis was. McGinnis was more of a driver type player. Haywood was, if you want to think of McGinnis more of a combo small forward, power forward, you can think that Haywood was definitely more of a power forward. So spent more of his time near the basket as well. But he spent 1 year in the ABA. He immediately won the MVP that year. The only year he was in the ABA, he won the MVP, averaging 30, 19.5, and 2. And he wasn't as good of a team player as McGinnis was. So that's why I have him ranked lower. But either way, both of them are very underrated. And Spencer Haywood didn't get inducted in the Hall of Fame until 2015. So he actually got inducted earlier than George McGinnis was. Unfortunately, that's the way it goes. But But I think either way, George McGinnis, Spencer Haywood, both of them are pretty underrated, given their achievements and their accolades. And I think it's just the ABA thing, right? Played in the 70s, played in the ABA. Yeah, the fact that any who plays their prime in the ABA or in the 1970s just gets overlooked in general. And the fact that the NBA doesn't acknowledge ABA achievements is why Mel Daniels, Artis Gilmore, Dan Issel, George McGinnis, and Spencer Haywood doesn't get the respect that they deserve. All right, next on my list is Paul Arizin, who's ranked number 53 on my all-time list and number 10 SF all-time. He's a 10-time All-Star, 4-time All-NBA, 1 ring, 1 Finals MVP, and I gave him this Finals MVP because he should have gotten it in 1956. Averaged 23, 9, and 2 for his career, and he was a swingman that could score from either the guard or forward position. He led the Warriors, this was the Philadelphia Warriors at that time, to their first ring, and for some reason, numbers not retired by the San Francisco Golden State Warriors, right? I don't know why. He played on that team, and obviously it's the same team, right? The Golden State Warriors now is the same team as the Philadelphia Warriors from back then. His number's not retired. I don't know why. But he should be up there in the all-time small forwards discussion. Again, left out just for the same reason that Bob Pettit and Dolph Schayes are forgotten, is just because he played in the 1950s, and he's definitely one of the best players of the 1950s, but his stats don't stand out even as much as Dolph Schayes or Bob Pettit's does, and his awards is not as much as theirs either. So if Bob Pettit or Dolph Schayes is not going to be remembered, then either is Paul Arizin, right? Paul Arizin has no chance to be remembered if Schayes and Pettit are not remembered. And that's unfortunate because if you look at his stats and awards in a vacuum, again, just not comparing to today's era, but just saying in his era, right? He was definitely one of the best forwards of his era. Then he should definitely be a top 10, or I have him number 10 on The Verge, right? He should definitely be in the best small forwards discussion because if you judge him based on his era, he was definitely up there. So anyways, Paul Arizin, also from my previous video, I also mentioned him too. Very underrated. Next up, I have Dennis Johnson, ranked number 57 on my all-time list, number 13 PG all-time. Now, Dennis Johnson, and I didn't realize how underrated he was until I put all defensive and defensive player of the year, all these defensive accolades, and I factored that into my algorithm. After I did that, Dennis Johnson came up. And another player that came up was Dave DeBusschere, actually. That's another player that's kind of underrated as well. But Dennis Johnson more so than Dave DeBusschere. Dennis Johnson, 5-time All-Star, 4-time All-NBA, 9-time All-Defensive, 3 rings, 1 Finals MVP, averaged 14, 4, and 5 in his career. Yeah, he was one of the greatest defensive guards ever. He was also the best player on the forgotten 1979 Supersonics team, which I think is one of the most underrated teams ever. It's almost never brought up in any conversation. It was kind of like the 2004 Pistons of the 1970s. So, yeah, I mean, 79 Sonics almost never get brought up. That was a great team, though. The fact is that Sonics team it didn't have any Hall of Famers until Dennis Johnson got inducted in the Hall of Fame, which was after his death in 2010, which is really sad, right? It took the Hall of Fame over 30 years to induct Dennis Johnson, and for over 30 years, the 1979 Supersonics didn't have any Hall of Famers on it. And only last year, Jack Sigma was inducted, giving it the second Hall of Famer. So if you want to talk about underrated teams, the 79 Sonics is up there. But yeah, he was, I didn't realize how underrated he was to me until I calculated all the defensive achievements he has, and wow, one of the greatest defensive guards ever. Incredibly clutch. For people who Boston Celtics fans should know, because DJ played on the Boston Celtics, obviously, huge clutch player in the big moments, very good defensive player. But very underrated still. Not a lot of people mention him in the all-time PGs list, which they should. He was underrated because he was mostly a defensive player, and defense doesn't get valued as much as offense does, unfortunately, even by the Hall of Fame. And I mean, proof of this is a bunch of guys I'm going to list after, right? Actually, first I'm going to list the next guy on my list. So Dennis Johnson, very underrated player. And the next on my list is Connie Hawkins, ranked number 65 on my all-time list, number 12 SF all-time. 5-time All-Star, 1 ring, 1 MVP, 1 Finals MVP, averaged 19, 9, and 4 for his career. So Pretty good all around stats, actually. He was unfairly blackballed from the NBA for a scandal that he never had anything to do with, along with Roger Brown, which I talked about before. He averaged 27, 13.5, and 4.6 his first year in the ABA, and he won the MVP. And then he went to the NBA 2 years later, but he was already kind of past his prime at that point. First of all, he started playing professionally like when he was 25, and it was a little bit late already. And then after his 4 years in the Phoenix Suns, he was already gone. He was already like pretty much past his prime and injured and stuff. But I think his time in the Phoenix Suns was still pretty good, and it's a shame that we didn't get to see Connie Hawkins' full career in the NBA because he could have been easily one of the greatest players ever. Just looking at his all-around stats, they're kind of, how can I say, it's like Julius Erving. Yeah, it's like Dr. J. He could have been like Dr. J, right, if he played his entire career in the NBA. And that's something because Dr. J is a top 15 player all time, right? And I think Dr. J is actually underrated to a degree. I didn't have him on this list, but I think he's underrated to a degree as well because people don't count his ABA achievements, which the NBA doesn't count his ABA achievements. And if you include Dr. J's ABA achievements, he's actually a 4-time MVP, 3-time champion, which is the same as LeBron James. But anyways, talking about Connie Hawkins here, he's underrated because his career was too short. He entered the NBA too late because he got blackballed unfairly. And then he got injured really quickly. He did have some pretty good years with the Suns, so the Suns did retire his number, but he only had 4 seasons with them, and that was it. Just one of those huge what ifs in NBA history, right? Like, what if Connie Hawkins played his entire career in the NBA? Like, he would be up there with Dr. J, I think. Right, next up, I kind of have 2 players here. So originally, I only had one of these guys, but then I realized they're both kind of underrated for similar reasons. So I'm just going to list them both right next to each other. Dave DeBusschere, ranked number 62 on my all-time list, number 17 PF all-time. 8-time All-Star, 10-time All-Defensive, averaged 16, 11, and 3 for his career. And Bobby Jones, ranked number 71 on my all-time list, number 21 SF all-time. He wasn't in my top 20 SFs, unfortunately, but he was very close. 4-time All-Star, 11-time All-Defensive, averaged 12, 6, and 3 in his career. Both of these guys, I think, are underrated because of their defense. They were really good defensively. And again, just like Dennis Johnson, I didn't realize how good these guys were until I made my list and I put my defensive accolades in my algorithm, like the all-time all-defensive teams and Defensive Player of the Year. I put all these defensive accolades in there, and then I realized how underrated these guys were. And it's because just people don't appreciate defense as much as offense. Even the Hall of Fame doesn't appreciate it. Like, Bobby Jones didn't get inducted in the Hall of Fame until last year. He was one of the greatest defensive wings of all time. Same with Dave DeBusschere. DeBusschere actually got inducted fairly quickly after he retired, but not Bobby Jones. I think the difference is that Dave DeBusschere actually had a pretty good offensive game as well. So that's why I have Dave DeBusschere as underrated, but not as much as Bobby Jones is. And the reason, yeah, just because people care about offense more than defense. And DeBusschere averaged 16 points a game, which is pretty good, and he's an 8-time All-Star. So he got inducted fairly quickly, but still pretty underrated because people don't realize just how good of a defensive player he was. If you take that all into account, he's a top 70 player all time. Bobby Jones, even more underrated because he wasn't as good offensively as Dave DeBusschere. He was just as good defensively, though. He was 11-time All-Defensive, and someone who's 11-time All-Defensive getting inducted just last year is crazy to think about, 30 years after their retirement. But just shows you the Hall of Fame doesn't really care about defensive players. Like the 4-time Defensive Player of the Year, Ben Wallace, is not in there. He should be. 8-time All-Defensive Player Michael Cooper should be in the Hall of Fame. He's not because he was never an All-Star. All-time not in there because his offense wasn't good enough. But you have Dikembe Mutombo in the Hall of Fame, which is very similar to Ben Wallace, even though Mutombo was probably a better offensive player, but still, they both have 4-time Defensive Player of the Year. I don't think that anyone would say that Mutombo or Wallace, either one of them are about the same in defense. I wouldn't say anyone would say Mutombo was better, right? They're both really, really good defenders, and they're both all-time great defenders. So if Mutombo makes the Hall of Fame, Ben Wallace should be in there, right? And Bobby Jones, if you think about 11-time All-NBA, if you think of All-Defensive the same way you think of All-NBA, can you think of any 11-time All-NBA player that didn't get inducted in the Hall of Fame until 30 years after they retired? No, right? So it just shows you All-Defensive, it isn't respected as much as All-NBA is. Just defense isn't respected as much. So Bobby Jones should have been in the Hall of Fame a long time ago. And it's a travesty he was only inducted last year. And again, not many people know about him. The reason is because he's mostly a defensive player, which is not memorable for people, right? Alvin Robertson, most people probably don't remember him either. He's also underrated. And he played in the 70s, like in the ABA when he was a starter. And that's not a good factor to be remembered. And in the 80s, which is more memorable than the 70s for a lot of people, he was a six man. So if you're a six man, you're obviously not going to be remembered as much as a starter. So yeah, that's the problem with Bobby Jones is when he was a starter, he played in the 70s. And then when he was playing the 80s, which is more remembered, he was a six man. He wasn't a starter. So I think that's why he tends to get left out of conversations. He really should be in more conversations of the best defensive players of all time. I actually had him ranked right below Scottie Pippen in my greatest defensive wings of all time. Right? So it's Scottie Pippen, John Havlicek should actually be in that discussion as well. And then Bobby Jones, right? Bobby Jones should be in the conversation, one of the great defensive wings of all time. And people just don't mention his name. They just forget about him, right? It's unfortunate. So Dave DeBusschere and Bobby Jones, both underrated. Bobby Jones more so. Adrian Dantley is next on my list, ranked number 73 on my all-time list, number 14 SF all-time, six-time All-Star, two-time All-NBA, two-time scoring champion, averaged 24, 6, and 3 in his career. Why do you think Adrian Dantley is underrated? Well, many people don't really bring him up on the greatest scorers conversation, but he really should be brought up more. He has the highest true shooting percentage of any perimeter player, 61.7%. He was just a scoring machine, and he was so efficient at it. And he won more scoring titles than any other player that decade, except for Michael Jordan and George Gervin, I think. And that was it, right? And there was a lot of players that were in scoring titles as SFs in that year. There's a lot of high-scoring SFs of that decade. So you have Dominique Wilkins, Alex English, Mark Aguirre, Marcus Johnson, Bernard King, and Adrian Dantley had more scoring titles than any of them, and he was also by far the most efficient. So I think Dantley's really underrated in that sense. He also missed out on a ring in 1988. He just missed out on a ring because of that foul called on Bill Laimbeer in Game 6 of that 1988 Finals. So a lot of Pistons fans probably remember that. I really do think he's one of the best scorers of all time. He should be in that discussion, but no one ever brings him up. Like Adrian Dantley, whenever you think of efficient scorers, like you probably think of Kevin Durant, right? Maybe you think of, in terms of field goal percentage, you might think of LeBron James, or you might even think of Steph Curry in terms of efficiency, right? But Adrian Dantley should be up there. I mean, he was incredibly efficient and averaged 24 points a game, which is actually quite a bit. That's more than Shaq, actually, right? And yeah, two-time scoring champion, and he really should be brought up more in conversations of the best defensive players ever. And I think he's underrated because he wasn't a flashy player. He doesn't have a ring. Like I said, he was very close to getting a ring. He doesn't have a ring, and yeah, it just wasn't one of those flashy players. Like, it's kind of like Alex English, how Alex English wasn't really well remembered in the 80s, even though he scored the most points in the 80s. Dantley was more efficient than Alex English and had more scoring titles. Also similar, not very well remembered. And he was also known to be kind of a black hole on offense, kind of similar to Melo, I would say. Except he's way more efficient than Melo is. So I would say Adrian Dantley is a better player than Carmelo Anthony, even though obviously Melo's name is going to be more familiar to a lot of people. But yeah, I would say Dantley is not a top 10 SF. I don't put him in my top 10 small forwards all time, but he definitely deserves to be in the top 15, I think. And he should be brought up in a lot more conversations of the best scorers ever, especially for the most efficient scorers ever. All right, lastly on my all-time underrated list is a guy I talked about in a separate video already, Neil Johnston. He's ranked number 74 on my all-time list, and I have him as the 20th best center of all time. The 6-time All-Star, 5-time All-NBA, 3-time scoring leader, 1-time rebounding leader. He has 1 ring, and he averaged 19, 11, and 2.5 in his career. Again, this is one of those guys that is underrated because he played his whole career in the 1950s. And I mean, like I said, even if Bob Pettit doesn't get remembered, if Dolph Schayes doesn't get remembered, if Paul Arizin doesn't get remembered, then Neil Johnston has no chance of getting remembered. Like, He was probably the most dominant center in between George Mikan and Bill Russell. I think he's more underrated than Mikan because I think he's better than Mikan. Mikan played with virtually no competition in the center position in the early 50s, and there was no goaltending back then. There was no shot clock when George Mikan was playing. So in a way, George Mikan was playing in a completely different era, and it was very different for him. And the rules allowed George Mikan to dominate back then. That made it harder for centers after him to dominate as much as he did. So I think that if you matched up Neil Johnston with George Mikan, I think Neil would have won, because Neil actually played in the mid 50s, like after the shot clock, after the goaltending. So I think Neil had slightly more competition than Mikan did, and he had more rules to deal with than Mikan did. So that's why I put him ahead of. Well, I have George Mikan ahead on the all-time list, but I think that if you put him 1-on-1, I think Neil Johnston would actually be better. Three-time scoring leader is nothing to scoff at that time, right? Especially when he was playing at the same time as Pettit and Arizin, who was on the same team as him, right? So he played with another really good scorer on his team, Paul Arizin, and he still got 3 scoring titles. So yeah, very underrated. Obviously, completely forgotten in most conversations. And just like, yeah, people are not going to remember his teammate, Paul Arizin, who is the better player on most of their teams. They're not going to remember the second best player on the Philadelphia Warriors, which was Neil Johnston. All right, so that's it. That's my top 20 all-time most underrated NBA, ABA players. I know I kind of snuck in Dave DeBusschere there with Bobby Jones is sort of 21, but anyways, that's kind of a combo pack. And I had honorable mentions as well. So I hope you guys enjoy this video, and leave me any comments if you agree or disagree. I think these guys get left out of way too many conversations, and really should be ranked higher than they are by most players and analysts. A lot of times I talk about the ESPN top 75 list because I use that as kind of the watermark for how players are ranked, because they usually talk about that on the sports shows, right? Like, oh, where are you on the ESPN all-time top list or whatever. And I'm pretty sure almost all the guys I named is either not on the list or they're much lower than they should be. So I'm pretty sure like Artis Gilmore is number 74 on that list. Artis Gilmore should be top 20 all time, I'm telling you. So yeah, yeah, all these guys on the list are either not on that list, not remembered by even ESPN, or even by Bill Simmons sometimes. I like Bill Simmons, but even he left out guys like Mel Daniels, and George McGinnis, and Spencer Haywood, and Bobby Jones, and Neil Johnston from his list. But yeah, like, those are my picks, and these guys are ranked much lower than they really should be ranked, according to my analysis. So that's it. Hope you guys enjoy my video, and please leave me comments if you agree or disagree, or if you have your own list.